Today we return to Paul's letter to the Ephesian congregation. We return to continue to explore the nature of life in community and the opportunities that we have as those who are open to the work of God's Spirit among us. Now, some may say, but I don't think, that I'm being too overly optimistic when I express my conviction that I sort of think that most of us want to be kind. I believe that most of us want to do the right thing. Most of the time, most of us have reasonably pure hearts. We have decent motives. But what comes out of our mouths is often quite another thing. It doesn't always match our inner intentions to be fine, upstanding, honorable people. Now, none of us give in to complaining, grumbling, and blaming all the time. But most of us do some of the time. We moan and complain and take little pieces of information about each other and use it to boost our own egos. We pick at the most insignificant things. We complain when things aren't exactly like we like them or when others don't do things our way. We scrutinize their motives and imagine the worst, all the while acting, of course, as if we are beyond reproach. Most of us fall into some of these behaviors, at least from time to time. It's human nature. And we've all of us have heard or been the subject of others' petty, sometimes destructive complaints. After all, even Jesus was on the receiving end of such harshness. We heard about it today. But this wasn't the only time that he got the brunt of complaints and belittling accusations. Today we hear John tell about Jesus really kind of putting himself out there. He offers himself to those who would have him. Says he'll be there for them, connect with them, tells them that he's actually come from God to be the bread of life for them, to nourish them, to renew them, to fill them. And what did they do? They complained about his offer. They picked it apart, assumed that he was being literal about coming from heaven, didn't even take the time to reflect on what he really meant. They basically said, "Well, who does he think he is to say he's come from heaven? We know who his parents are." Even Jesus isn't immune to the over-dissecting criticism of naysayers, those who have let themselves slip into the destructive culture of criticism that blinds them to the gift of God, the gift of Jesus that's right before their eyes. Now, this behavior was probably no surprise to Jesus. He'd read the Bible, after all. He'd read the stories of the prophets and Moses and about the complaining people, those who complained in the face of honest and helpful leadership. You remember the grumbling of the liberated slaves as Moses led them toward the promised land. You remember their woe is me cries. We were better off as slaves in Egypt than starving in the desert. Why'd you bring us out here? They were quick to say. Now, I want to backtrack just a little bit and go to where I went with the children this morning. I want to just offer a clarification about complaining and about saying what's on our minds. Many of us grew up, I know, on the other side of this complaint coin. That is, we weren't allowed to speak our resistance, to name our troubles. We were shushed, shamed, or scolded into silence. Know what I mean? But we've learned, some of us, that we need to speak out, even when it goes against the grain, and that's a good thing. It's a good thing unless grumbling takes us over, unless it becomes a way of life, unless the shadows of complaint block the sun of blessing that's shining on us, unless we let it infect our spirits and keep us in a constant state of blaming and perceiving negativity. It's a good thing unless our moaning becomes a shield protecting us from facing our own fallibility and our own error. And while it's important for us to express our feelings, we need, I believe, to keep perspective, to realize that our feelings are our truth, but they're rarely the whole truth. When we take this to heart, it keeps us from too eagerly and too quickly assigning blame. That shield of blaming and complaining can keep us in a state of self-righteousness. The shield is around us while the arrows fly at others. That's the assumption in a lot of complaint, you know. I can criticize because I know better. I could do it better, whatever it is. I could make better judgments and decisions. I would certainly have purer motives than he does. I'd probably even look better doing it and behave in an unquestionably right and righteous way. Problem is, of course, that this just isn't the whole truth about us or others. Well, that's one problem with living in a culture of complaint. Another problem is, like the Moses-following grumblers in Exodus, like those to whom Paul was writing in the church in Ephesus, and like those who picked at the words of Jesus. Another problem with the culture of complaint is that wrangling, judging, accusing, grumbling, gossiping, and moaning keep us from seeing and realizing the praiseworthy beauty and abundance that are right in front of us. Now, Paul is honest. He's being honest with the church folk in Ephesus. He knows that they care deeply and believe passionately. And where those things are true, there is bound to be what? Conflict. Bound to be conflict. Disagreements, different ways, and bold actions sometimes provoke anger. We can't gather a bunch of passionately devoted people and not eventually clash in some way. Paul isn't naive. He gets that. He knows it's true, and he doesn't say that clashing is wrong. But he urges them to temper their response, to let anything that they say be honest, useful, kind, and full of grace. And he ties these tall demands to their realization that God offers constant grace to them. They and we have all had love extended to us, grace and forgiveness, many times over, I suspect, not only from God, but from other people as well. And so Paul seems to ask, and I ask us today, is it too much to ask that we pass that on? Not in a, oh, can't we all just be nice sort of way? Because that kind of leads to not speaking the truth. But that we do it, we speak the truth, even when it's tough. And we do it with kindness and love. Paul isn't naive. And we aren't naive either. We know, if we've been in church, or I guess any other organization for that matter, for long, we know that we do get irritated, or at least I do. And sometimes we get irritated with the same person for the upteenth time about the same behavior. Yes? And so every time her name comes up, it makes my blood boil. And I just have to let it out. I just have to grumble. And we all know that we have feelings when we try to live in community with each other, don't we? We have feelings. We feel left out or singled out, and so we whine and moan to anybody who'll listen to us. But sometimes, my friends, it takes us over, and we can't see anything good about those people. But don't misunderstand. I'm not standing here this morning to simply say to you, okay, quit it. Stop complaining, quit feeling sorry for yourself, and never make judgments about each other. Stop it. I'm not going to tell you that. I'm not going to tell you to stuff your feelings, to just be nice and pretend that things are okay with you if they're not. At home, at work, or at church. Nope, I'm not going to say that. I'm not even going to suggest that criticism is a bad thing. On the contrary, I think we need a moral compass that differentiates among behaviors, ours and others. It helps us correct life in the body. Rather, what I'd like to offer this morning is to suggest two spiritual remedies to that myopic culture of complaint, this infection of non-reflectively seeing the glass half empty, the unexamined imperative to see the negative first before we dare look for the positive, and often to the exclusion of it, and the horrible symptoms that take over in a culture of complaining: bitterness, resentment, anger, alienation from others, and an argumentative, critical spirit. The first remedy is what I talked with the kids about. It's gratitude. But a specific sort of gratitude, not just walking out and saying, "Isn't the sky beautiful? I'm really grateful for it." But this sort of gratitude, the realization that we have been given the benefit of the doubt and a measure of grace, and that leads us to a deep and constant abiding attitude of gratitude. Standing just behind this sort of gratitude, of course, is humility. That is, recognizing and claiming our own humanity and fallibility. Because when we're clear about our own humanity, both our gifts and our failures, and remember the grace that we've been offered, we become ready, I believe, more ready to offer that kindness and acceptance to others without regard, now listen to this, without regard to whether they offer it to us and others or not. Gratitude like this overflows with all we've received, and it empowers us as a principle to offer grace to others. Where gratitude abounds, grace emerges, and complaining begins to fade. The second remedy I'd like to offer to a self and others destructive culture of complaint is compassion. I'm convinced that the opposite of complaining is not shut up. Neither is it stuff it or just let it go. Rather, I think maybe the opposite of complaining is compassion. Compassion is sensitive to the underlying feelings and suffering of others. Compassion assumes that the one who irritates you needs your love and kindness much more than your criticism. Compassion assumes, now listen to this one, compassion assumes that you, that I, that we have the power to heal some deep wound in another person by offering grace instead of grumbling. With the truth, of course. Have compassion for everyone you meet, writes Miller Williams. What appears to be bad manners, an ill temper, or cynicism is a sign of things that no ears have heard, no eyes have seen. You do not know, he says, what wars are going on down there where the spirit meets the bone. So take a moment. Take a moment to remember when someone has given you the benefit of the doubt. When someone has offered you grace and forgiveness when you've done something less than stellar. And then, reflecting on that, consider what you could do to make someone who has offended you in some way equally grateful to you for the grace given to them. A principle that I found really helpful in trying to craft these things in my life is found in Stephen Covey's book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. It simply says this: seek first to understand, and only then to be understood. This is an expression, I believe, of compassion, a way of offering the grace of God to another, an opportunity for love in action. Paul begins this passage with an admonition to speak truth in love. If we do that, if we do it proactively, if we speak the truth in love, we reduce our need to grumble because we've actually done something to remedy the problem. Tell the truth as you see it. Say it. But say it to the person to whom it needs to be said rather than 12 other people. Failing to speak the truth in a loving, appropriate way to the appropriate person is one of the deep roots of the culture of complaint. It might go something like this. I offended you. But you tell Sue, who is irate about it, who tells Mark, who gets in a huff and remembers when I offended him 3 years ago. Meanwhile, Mark thinks Sue is really out of line for telling something that didn't happen to her, and so he calls Karen to express his outrage and calls Sue a few choice names. All this time, I, the original offender, am clueless. You're all angry, and I'm not sure why you're grumbling about each other. It could go something like that. The culture of complaint keeps us from seeing each other's goodness, and it keeps us from honestly facing our own capability to be just as irritating and just as prone to mistakes as everyone else. So we say whatever it takes to make ourselves feel better. That may be blaming someone for excluding us rather than taking the responsibility and privilege of initiating and reaching out to others. It may be taking a little grain of truth and using it to make someone else look bad so that we can feel all right that day. Or it may be gossiping to let others know that we have inside information. How do we speak to and about each other? Our answer to this question is an indicator of our spiritual maturity that we talked about last week. And like a thermometer, it measures our health and may signal an infection in the body. One of Paul's most compelling images of the church is of one body. We are the body of Christ, he tells us, each of us an indispensable part. And all the parts work together so that we can be the presence of Christ, the body of Christ to each other and in the world. The healing, hope-offering, uplifting, honest, compelling presence of Christ. The infection of complaint and judgment and thoughtless speech makes the body sick. It diminishes our power to live in love. It shrouds our eyes, preventing us from seeing each other's needs and humanity, gifts and goodness. And it ultimately, I believe, dims our own vision of the light of God. When I moved to Oregon a number of years ago, I had a lot of difficulty adjusting to the cloudiness and rain. Have you been to Oregon? It's gorgeous, but it rains all the time. And when it's not raining, it's cloudy. And so I complained about it, just like I am now, a lot. Eventually, I just would wake up every morning to yet another overcast day, and I'd feel grumbly and cranky. It became an attitude of my life until a sunbreak would come. Now, if you've lived in or visited the Pacific Northwest, you know about sunbreaks. Sunbreaks are glorious moments when the sun erupts powerfully through the clouds with brilliance and even with palpable warmth. Sunbreaks would take my breath away. In fact, I didn't even realize that grumbling and negativity had kind of come to live inside me and dominate my mood until the sun broke through and shed light on it all. In that sudden light, I could see clearly, I could see myself, and I could see things around me in light. I know it sounds like an overstatement, but it's true that hope and optimism in that moment flooded my soul. So it is when we have been dulled and jaded by complaining and grumbling and criticizing, the clouds and shadows shroud us in such negativity that we can't see clearly. We can't see ourselves or others or the gifts around us. We don't even know that we have been living without gratitude and compassion. But gratitude and compassion are our remedies. when we take them up first, rather than jumping to complaining conclusions, we may just find that we are the ones who are blessed by it. We'll be showered with grace and offer the opportunity to pass it along. We'll be offered that bread of life, that self-giving, other-loving way of Jesus to feed our own souls. And we'll find enough gratitude and compassion to offer light to others. The Dalai Lama encourages us with this simple statement: be kind whenever possible. It is always possible. And my friends, it's medicine for our souls and for our community. Amen. What comes out of our mouths is often quite another thing. It doesn't always match our inner intentions to be fine, upstanding, honorable people. Now, none of us give in to complaining, grumbling, and blaming all the time. But most of us do some of the time. We moan and complain and take little pieces of information about each other and use it to boost human nature. And we've all of us have heard or been the subject of others' petty, sometimes destructive complaints. After all, even Jesus was on the receiving end of such harshness. We heard about it today. But this wasn't the only time that he got the brunt of complaints and belittling accusations. Today we hear John tell about Jesus really kind of putting himself out there. He offers him to the work of God's Spirit among us. Now, some may say, but I don't think, that I'm being too overly optimistic when I express my conviction that I sort of think that most of us want to be kind. I believe that most of us want to do the right thing. Most of the time, most of us have reasonably pure hearts. We have decent motives. But our own egos, we pick at the most insignificant things. We complain when things aren't exactly like we like them or when others don't do things our way. We scrutinize their motives and imagine the worst, all the while acting, of course, as if we are beyond reproach. Most of us fall into some of these behaviors, at least from time to time. It's Today we return to Paul's letter to the Ephesian congregation. We return to continue to explore the nature of life in community and the opportunities that we have as those who are open to